Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank you for coming out on Election Day to our town hall meeting. Today's meeting is a town hall, so we're going to encourage questions as we go along, and then we'll be around afterwards. The general theme is preserving and passing assets. We're happy to address anything you want to talk about. And then we've had some questions already on some of the things we hear a lot about, and people have called in, so we'll get started addressing those. We're definitely going to cover a wide range of topics. Joining me on the dais is Cale Scholes, just to my immediate left, and then Nick Warsh. Also here are the other advisors from the office, Mark, Greg, and Mike. And then also from the office, Deanna, Tracy, Nancy, Bobby, and Darlene. And they will be in the back. You'll see Nancy and Bobby with microphones. So if you have a question, you put up your hand and one of them will find you, or we'll kind of direct them to you. One of the things that I think is important beyond all the news and all the business are how we do for the community. And this election has certainly been very contentious. One of the core values that we've always had is to make people's lives better, whether it's yours, our clients, our teams, or our communities. And part of that's an initiative we started about 3 years ago in 2013 called Carver Cares. The idea was to raise awareness of local nonprofits and also to help support them monetarily. But there are a tremendous number of nonprofits in Lake County, and we're trying to make people aware of what they do, and also they can help all of us. We've done about 12 of these, and a lot of people have actually reached out. So our clients have said they're so glad they found out about what these organizations are doing, because they could either use them personally or they could help somebody else. So today's Carver Cares partners, Sub-Zero Mission. There's some information on the tables. Joining me from Sub-Zero is Frank Vaccarelli and Karen Supman. And Sub-Zero, it's been around about 3 years, I think now.
2011.
2011, there you go. So I'm going to have Frank just introduce them very quickly. Karen.
Thank you very much for having us here. Very, very generous of you to take some time to listen to us. I'm Frank, this is Karen. We're on the board of Sub-Zero Mission. Sub-Zero Mission delivers hats, coats, gloves, boots, sleeping bags, and other warming items to homeless in the Northeast Ohio area and other regions during the cold winter months. We have a bus. We go out on the bus several times a year. The mission was founded, and we are very much staffed by veterans. So we do have a focus on veterans because they make up a high percentage of homeless out there, and we also make sure they get contact to services. What you can do for us is you can either donate warming items, you can donate your time or talent, or most importantly, we do have a need for money, for fuel, for the trips we take. We do have a building for storage where people can drop things off during the day, during the week. Subzeromission.org is our website. It should answer almost all of the questions that you have. If not, there is contact information on there. Subzeromission.org. There are some pamphlets on the table as you go out. Once again, thank you. Thank you very much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks. So, Election Day, what's it mean? That's one of the first questions we got. Couple things. Every one of you should have gotten one of these big booklets. If you didn't, we have some more outside. In the back, there's a great piece about the election. It's about 10 pages long, but it walks through kind of a much broader range of topics that then time would allow us to talk about. What I would tell you is, in the 22 elections since 1928, the S&P 500 has fallen, and pretty sharply, 15 times the day after the election. So if we see a pretty steep drop tomorrow, it really wouldn't be unprecedented or unexpected. In 2008, the S&P dropped almost 5% the day after the election. Since then, though, it's averaged a 13% return per year. So from November 4th of 2008 through last week, the average has been a positive 13%. After President Obama got elected in 2012, the market dropped 3.6%. That's a pretty decent drop. So, we believe that our clients are well allocated. We've talked to you about needs and objectives. You have plenty of cash. But inevitably, the market's going to drop, and the media is going to go crazy about how bad things are. You know the story. You've heard me say this for 30 years. The interesting thing this time, which is very different than the past, and we saw this with the Brexit, is there's nowhere for the money to go. Some of you remember when the Brexit was announced on June 24th, the market dropped about 3.6%. Friday, they announced that the vote had gone unexpectedly to secede from the European Union. Over the weekend, there was breaking news that the global economy was going to collapse because the European Union was collapsing. Monday, our stock market dropped pretty sharply, about 600 points. And the next week, we hit a record high. And I think part of it's because people may pull out when they panic, but where do you put the money? The bank doesn't pay anything today. If you go back when you could get a 7-8% CD or 6% in your savings account, there was an alternative. People are not investing in Europe, they're not investing in Asia, they're not investing in South America, certainly not Africa or the Middle East. Real estate's not something that's easy to invest in. So where does it go? Inevitably what happens is people pull out and they jump right back in. And typically it's the smaller investor that panics, gets out, they lose, they miss the bump up, and then they finally get back in and they've missed the thing, whereas the institutional people jump in. So our advice is if you're properly allocated, which you should be, just don't do anything. If you have questions or concerns, give us a call. Now, why would we make changes? And this is one of the other questions we get a lot. 3 reasons that we would recommend a change to your portfolio. 1, something changes with you. You need some money, you need some income, your tax situation changes. 2, if the allocation of your investments gets out of whack from what we've agreed to. So we need to reallocate. And that's typically something we can do when you come in for your regular reviews. Or 3, if there's an issue or an opportunity with an individual investment. An issue might be a manager leaves. An opportunity might be we can shift it to something that's less expensive or that's doing a little bit better. Now, in some cases, we'll contact you between reviews. And I should point out that whether it's someone I speak to regularly or Nick or Gail or Mark, someone else from the office may call you. It's not that we're ignoring you. He may get a call from Bobby or Nancy or Mike, Greg. It's just, if we're sitting in meetings talking to people, we want to make sure we get in touch with you, then we're going to ask someone to give you a call. It's not that we're blowing you off, but you may hear from other people in the office. Now that was another question we just got, is why do you have all these people on the team? Those of you that have known me for 25 or 30 years know we started out fairly small. And then we've grown, especially since 2011. Our team has grown quite a bit. And the reason is that we want to be able to reach out to you personally. Unlike a lot of other firms, we don't use models. We don't have a set allocation for everybody. And we don't use what's called discretion, where we can just make decisions and tell you what we did. We firmly believe it's your money and you should make the decision with our advice. So you need to make an informed decision. But part of that is having a larger team so that we can do that and so that we can monitor things in a way that just takes a lot of people. The other thing is, quite frankly, behind the scenes, things are becoming a little more complex, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So it's getting to the point where you need people to handle some of the regulatory tasks and technical tasks and putting things like this together. And so that's why the team grows. When I started in 1986, I started by myself. And I opened an office for a regional firm. We opened the office in March of 1987. At the time, it was myself and one other person. By 1988, I really had a vision that I wanted to create more of a service business, not just selling investments. We don't sell investments. A lot of firms are brokerage firms. We really want to help people achieve whatever their vision is. That's why we call it personal vision planning. And so at the time, there's only so many hours a day and so much one person can do. Said, we need to hire more people. And they said no. They said, well, we need to expand the range of things beyond this little list of approved products. This isn't necessarily the best for everybody. I want to be able to do whatever's best that's out there. And they said no. And so by the fall of 1990, it's really becoming an issue. And so we decided to set up Carver Financial Services, as I said before, with a very clear vision of just simply making people's lives better. And the goal was, we didn't want to have a proprietary products. We didn't want to have to sell what someone told us to sell. I didn't want to be beholden to anybody. So while your accounts are at Raymond James and the statements come from them, we're totally independent. We simply use them to provide custody of assets, insurance on the account, and reporting. They do not tell us what to do, how to do it, what to sell. And with some of the changes that are coming, we're going to talk about in a second, this is going to become a very important distinction. So in 1990, hired 2 people right off the bat, and then we've grown ever since. Now, it's important to understand that we feel this gives you quicker access to professionals. Every one of the advisors in the office has their certified financial planning designation, and a number of other people, both Bobby and Nancy, are working on theirs. Should have them in the next year or so. Everybody's obviously licensed, and everybody takes their continuing education very seriously. But it also means if you need something done administratively, like new checks or change of address or something of that nature, you can speak to the administrative person directly that does it. Because frankly, I don't know how to do it anyway. So if you call me and say, Randy, I need more checks, I'm going to have to ask Bobby or Nancy or Tracy or Marge or somebody in the office to do that. No matter who you meet with, we are a team. And one of the questions we get is, well, if I meet with someone else, does it affect their compensation? No. All the advisors in the office are on salary. They're not compensated on what they sell, how they sell it. So if you normally meet with Mark or Gail and you need to meet with Nick or myself, that's fine. We appreciate the consideration, but that absolutely makes no difference who you meet with. Our goal is to answer your question as quickly as we can in a schedule that fits your needs. And that's also why you may see 2 people in meetings now. It may be one of the assistants, like Polly or Becky or Sarah, or it may be another advisor. Now, one of the things that we've encouraged in the last couple of years is to really do your estate planning. Have a good estate plan, to have a succession plan. What about us? Well, that's important. And what I can tell you is that we do have a succession plan. The succession plan is Nick, Gail, and Mark. Mark's been with the firm 17 years, Gail's been there 12, and Nick's been there 7. If something were to happen to me or to any of them, we have a written succession plan so the business continues. That's also why with the team, we've added Mike and Greg, and you've also got Bobby and Nancy working in advisory capacity. That's the next generation. So our goal with the larger team is to have that succession plan in place. So one of the questions we got the other day, and this ties back to some of the stuff that I've been talking about, is I heard the government's taking over the IRAs. Well, not really, but sort of. So here's the deal. April 10th of next year, the Department of Labor will now regulate all IRAs in the United States. SEP IRAs, Roth IRAs, and pretty much any type of retirement plan. What this comes from is, for a number of years, President Obama wanted the government more involved, and ostensibly, they wanted to accomplish two things: to increase the transparency of expenses to investors, and to reduce conflicts of interest. And so this never happened from the SEC or FINRA. So last year, after a number of years of bringing this up, President Obama went to the Department of Labor, said, you need to come up with a bill, and we're going to take it to Congress. Congress voted in April of 2016. The bill passed, despite some fight. They announced this, which nobody heard. It was actually the day of the Wisconsin primary. President Obama made an hour-long speech about this. And it will go into effect April 10th of this year and have to be fully implemented by next year. Now, on the surface, the goals are pretty good. Know what you're paying, transparency, and eliminate conflicts of interest. I would say this is similar to Obamacare. The idea was great, but the execution kind of sucked. This type of rule has been put in place in other countries, so we can kind of look and get an idea of what's going to happen. First and foremost, because it's going to require additional disclosure, there's a lot of expense to doing that. And therefore, what happens is a lot of firms are dropping smaller IRAs. In the case of some firms, the minimum IRA will be $250,000. Some will be $100,000. But smaller investors are going to get hurt and pushed into what they call robo solutions, where you give your money basically to a computer to manage. The other thing that it does, eliminating conflicts of interest, which sounds good, is the problem is that Fidelity funds could not sell Fidelity. That's a conflict of interest. Vanguard can't sell Vanguard. That would be a conflict of interest. So they're going to have this thing called a best interest contract exemption, where you can sign off saying, I know this isn't in my best interest, and I know it's a conflict of interest, but I want to do it anyway. Some firms have said they're not going to do that agreement. Merrill Lynch for one, Commonwealth for another. And what that means is you can't have commission-based IRAs. You have to be on a flat fee. So what's all this mean to you? We have done primarily fee-based accounts for the last 5 or 6 years. So many of you already have a flat fee-based account. If you don't, it's something we're going to talk to you about. Because ultimately now, because we can discount fees down, it may actually save you a little bit of money. The other big change is, until now, advisory firms have been held to a fiduciary standard. Fiduciary standard means they had to do what's in your best interest. We have been an advisory firm since 1990. We've always been held to a fiduciary standard. Brokerage firms, however, have always been held to a suitability standard, which means they don't have to do what's in your best interest. They just have to do what's suitable. So think about it this way. If there's a mutual fund that's an S&P 500 fund that costs 5% a year, and there's another fund that costs 0.5% a year, they could sell you the 5% fund because it's just as suitable as the other. It's just not better for you. Or put it another way, you go to the doctor, they say you have to take Lipitor. And Lipitor is $500 a month, or the generic is free up at Walmart. Doctor says, oh, no, you got to take the brand name. And then you find out Pfizer's kicking him back for every prescription. Well, they're both suitable, it's the same drug, but one's clearly better. I think that's going to be a good thing, the fact that everyone has to operate in that standard. But what I can tell you is you're going to hear these headlines like, government's taking IRAs, government's taking over. So there's going to be a lot of noise and panic. Ultimately, it should not affect any of our clients negatively. If you have questions, let us know. As we do reviews or as we reach out to you, we'll talk about the structure of the account as far as that goes. But I think in the end, this could be a good thing. Now, what happened, the United Kingdom passed a rule like this, and so did Australia. And what happened was a number of smaller investors, advisors just said, we won't deal with you. You got to go to some robo solution. And also the number of advisors dropped. In the UK, it dropped by about 25%. People retired or just said, this is too much. We don't want to comply with this. We're retiring. We're getting out of the business. So I would expect you're going to hear more about firms consolidating, going out of business, advisors leaving. And again, once we get past the election, you're going to hear more about this. I think it'll be the biggest financial issue in the last 50 years. It's huge. But again, any of our clients, first of all, it shouldn't make a huge difference to begin with. And second of all, I think it could ultimately benefit you. Last one for me, because this is one we get a lot, is how can I reduce all the paper I receive? I get a lot of stuff. Couple things. First of all, you can elect electronic delivery. If you have online access, you can elect to get things electronically. You could still get paper statements, but get rid of the rest of the stuff. Second thing is, if you have accounts all over the place, you have a bank IRA and another IRA, this firm, that firm, is to start to consolidate things. The world's certainly complicated enough without having things scattered. Consolidating can make things much easier, both from a tax standpoint and also just staying sane about all the stuff you get. Now, there are a number of advantages to doing that, but understandably, we hear the concern, well, that's great, but I don't want to keep all my eggs in one basket. And so I'm going to let Gail maybe talk a little about that.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. And that's usually the question, something along the lines of, yeah, I really don't want to have all my eggs in one basket. Obviously, everybody knows that's not ideal, and that's a recipe for disaster. But is consolidating accounts with Raymond James safe? And what I would tell you is that it's really important to draw a distinction between having all of your assets in one investment versus having all of your investments on one statement. Two totally different things. And the latter is really what Raymond James does, is it's taking all those different individual investments that you have and consolidating it into one statement, one easy to read document. So those investments that you have, whether they're at Fidelity or Vanguard or American funds, those funds and the assets are still with those fund companies. All that Raymond James is doing is compiling that record keeping and reporting. So what are some of the types of insurance that Raymond James provides on these types of accounts? There's really three of them: FDIC insurance, SIPC insurance, and then Raymond James also provides what's called excess SIPC insurance through various syndicates of Lloyd's of London. And most of you are probably familiar with what FDIC insurance is. Each of you, you have coverage at your bank, on your bank accounts, up to $250,000 per account. What Raymond James does is they actually take that a step further by partnering internally with 10 banks to bring up that FDIC and coverage amount to potentially up to $2.5 million of full FDIC coverage. So you actually would have potentially higher FDIC insurance limits with Raymond James accounts. So what are some of the other advantages and reasons why you might want to consider consolidating accounts with Raymond James? And it really all boils down to, by consolidating accounts, it really provides us a better opportunity to give you better advice and also potentially lower your cost. So a couple specific ways that we can do that is, we want to make sure that beneficiaries, for instance, on all of your accounts, can't tell you how many times we've seen or heard horror stories of old, outdated beneficiary designations. Mom or dad, something happens, and after the fact, we find out that mom or dad never got around to removing the ex-spouse as the primary beneficiary, or grandma and grandpa set up an account that's earmarked for the grandkids, And unfortunately, the two youngest grandchildren were not included because they weren't around at the time that the account was set up. So that's why you'll notice that every time that you're in a meeting with your advisor, for the most part, we're going to be checking those beneficiaries. It may seem, every handful of months we're asking the same questions, but it's really important we make sure that those beneficiary designations are accurate and up to date. Another thing that consolidating accounts can help you do is help to minimize investment overlap. So similarly to when you go to visit the doctor, the first thing they're going to ask you is what types of medications are you on? And the reason that they're asking that is that they want to make sure that anything that they prescribe you is not going to have an adverse impact or reaction with one of your current medications. So our recommendations and our advice, the only way we can provide you with our best advice is if we have a handle on the entire picture. In addition to that, tax planning becomes a lot easier when accounts are consolidated, and your CPA is going to be somebody who would be really happy if you consolidate accounts, because as opposed to you showing up at their office in April with your box full of tax forms, you're going to simply hand them an envelope that has all of your investments consolidated on one report. But from a planning standpoint, where we can help you there is, and this is a perfect time of year to be talking about this, is we're going through all of our taxable accounts, identifying situations where clients might have realized capital gains this year, and seeing if there's any opportunities that we can offset those gains with losses. So by looking at the overall picture, it allows us to give you more tax efficient investing advice. And then finally, the last advantage is it potentially could lower your costs. So Raymond James has a tiered fee structure that is based upon the household assets. So as you have more accounts under the Raymond James umbrella, again, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to remove or change the investments that you have, but having more accounts under that Raymond James umbrella could potentially qualify you for lower costs, which would bring down the cost of investment on all of your accounts. And like Randy always says, it's not what you make, but what you keep that's most important. So those are definitely some advantages to consolidating accounts, and that's a question we get from time to time. Another question I wanted to bring up that we received is we have a lot of clients that are charitably inclined. We heard about what Sub-Zero does in the neighborhood or in the community, and it's one of the reasons that we started Carver Cares. Is we have a lot of clients that are charitably inclined. They want to make a difference in their community. But the question we get is, well, how do I make these contributions and make them as tax efficient as possible? And you might have missed it, but the government actually did get something done last year. They, at the end of the year, it kind of flew under the radar, but they did permanently pass what's called Qualified Charitable Distribution, or QCD. And what that is that's for people who are over the age of 70 and a half. And as you know, when you're over 70 and a half, for many of your retirement accounts, you're required to take a small amount out each year. So what the Qualified Charitable Distribution does is if you make that contribution to the charity directly out of your RMD, required minimum distribution dollars, you not only receive that same benefit that you would have received when you wrote that check to the charity in previous years, but not to get too far into the weeds, the deduction actually becomes what's called an above-the-line deduction. The bottom line is it potentially could, in addition to receiving that same tax benefit, it could also make your Social Security less taxable. It could also potentially lower the Medicare premiums that you're subject to. So if you're over 70 and a half, you're charitably inclined, qualified charitable distributions are something that you might want to talk to your advisor about to see if that makes sense. And then the last topic, and we get several questions on this, is regarding long-term care. So long-term care is something that probably just about everybody in this room has had some sort of an experience with, whether it's directly or indirectly. But it's a big issue, and it's in our opinion the greatest unfunded liability that most families face. The average cost of care in Ohio last year was $67,000 a year if you had a long-term care event. And long-term care insurance is something that can prevent against one of those catastrophic events, really significantly impacting your nest egg. And that's the thing about health, is that health isn't something we can control. You guys are all, for the most part, enjoying comfortable retirements. It's because you've made good financial decisions in the past. You started saving early, never lived with outside your means. But unfortunately, a bad diagnosis, something along those lines, is something that we can't control. So Our position on long-term care is that everybody should at least have the conversation about it to see if it makes sense. And then the question becomes, well, how do we structure the long-term care insurance, and what makes the most sense based on my situation and my assets? And then, of course, in this one, this question was from my father. He's of the opinion that, and he's not the only one. I'm bringing it up because we hear this a lot. His plan is that he's never going into a home because he doesn't need long-term care. And that's all well and good, but the issue with that type of an approach is that the statistics don't lie, and the statistics are that 60% of people over the age of 65 will at some point in their lives need long-term care. And what he doesn't understand, and drives me crazy, is that he's probably not going to be that person that decides whether or not he's going into a long-term care facility. And then the somewhat ironic thing is that long-term care insurance, the thing that he and a lot of people avoid having the conversation about because they don't think that they're going to need it, or they don't want to go into a nursing home. The long-term care insurance is probably the one thing that could keep you out of the nursing home. And people sometimes refer to long-term care insurance as nursing home insurance, and that's certainly somewhat of a misnomer, because what long-term care insurance really does in a lot of cases is it actually keeps you out of the nursing home, because you have a benefit that, and most of these policies have home health care benefits that would allow you to receive those same types of services and care from the comfort of your own home and keep you out of the nursing home. So, last question on long-term care is, are there different types of long-term care insurance? And the answer is yes. There's really two main types. First one is traditional. The traditional long-term care policy has been around for a long time. It's along the same lines of car insurance, where sort of pay as you go. You pay a premium each year. If you have a long-term care event, you need the coverage. The insurance is there for you. If hopefully you don't need those services, the premium's gone, and you move on to the next year and you pay that same premium again. So sort of that use it or lose it structure, and that's worked all well and good up until the last couple of years. And one of the issues with those traditional policies that we've seen is in a lot of cases there have been significant increases to those annual premiums, sometimes to the tune of 30 or 40% a year. So those annual increases are really shifting people towards looking at the other type of long-term care, which is something called asset-based long-term care. And the way that asset-based care works is you essentially carve out a portion of your portfolio. So let's, just for number purposes, let's say $100,000 that you would put into this long-term care policy as a lump sum. And where asset-based care, that some of the things that the asset-based product will provide over the traditional long-term care, there's really three main ones. And the first of which is typically the one that most people are attracted to, and that's a death benefit. So a lot of people are uncomfortable with spending a lot of money on long-term care because hey, if they don't use it, it just feels like we wasted a lot of money. The nice thing about the asset-based policy is that if you don't use it for long-term care, and that's the ideal situation, there's a death benefit that gets passed down to your beneficiaries. So the insurance company will pay out a benefit to somebody. The other nice thing about asset-based policies is that they have guaranteed premiums. The premiums are guaranteed contractually not to increase. So that, especially in an environment where we're seeing upwards of 30% increases in premiums on the traditional side, those asset-based policies address that concern. And then the final one is lifetime benefits. Now, this wasn't as important 10 years ago as it is now. The typical traditional long-term care policy would have a benefit period of 3, 4, maybe 5 years, and that worked just fine for everybody, because you go to a nursing home and it was rare that you would be there for much longer than that. Well, now with the prevalence of diseases such as Alzheimer's, our healthcare has improved which is a great thing. But what it means is that people are living longer with these chronic conditions, and a 3 or 4 or 5 year benefit period just might not cut it in this type of an environment. So those asset-based policies will provide a lifetime benefit. They do have options that allow you to extend it out to a lifetime benefit, which really does protect against that catastrophic Alzheimer's event or dementia that is a 10 or 15 or 20 year event. So for those reasons, we've seen a lot more people considering and looking at these asset-based policies. There's one final question that sometimes comes up and concern regarding long-term care. And it's this notion that, well, what happens if the insurance company fights my claim? And a lot of times it's, my friends, neighbors, brothers, uncle, or somebody, some person has some horror story about some insurance company giving them a real hard time about processing a claim. And what I would submit to you is that it seems to us in practice that this idea that the insurance companies are fighting legitimate claims, it's more of perception than reality, but it's a concern nonetheless. But again, the thing with those asset-based policies is that from the insurance company's standpoint, you have to understand that as soon as you fund that policy, that insurance company's on the hook to pay out a benefit. So they're going to either pay you a long-term care benefit if you need it for long-term care, or if you don't need it, they're paying out those proceeds to the beneficiary as a death benefit. So there really is no incentive for them to hang on to those dollars and fight a legitimate claim. So again, those asset-based policies, they do address that potential concern. Again, more perception than reality, but that is something that we hear about. So, of course, all insurance companies, all insurance policies, they have different costs and options, which depend on your unique circumstances. So if you want to explore this further, definitely set up an appointment with your advisor. I'm going to hand it over to Nick now. I think he's got some questions we hear regarding estate planning.
Morning. Election day, finally here. Anybody else excited? Yes. Doomsday. Well, if you thought long-term care was fun, now I'm going to talk about passing assets to someone else, which you know what that means. So one event has to happen before that happens. Anybody watching the election closely? They watched the second debate. Did you see what came out after the debate that said one of the candidates might have had a couple of the questions prior to the town hall? I can guarantee you that for integrity and to make sure I knew all the answers, I got the questions before this part. So the first question we get is, what's holistic planning, and how does estate planning or passing assets to somebody else fit into that? And if you want to think of holistic planning as an engine, there's a lot of moving parts. There's also a lot of different fluids. There's oil, there's steering fluid, there's windshield wiper fluid, there's transmission fluid. And you can relate that to estate planning, tax planning, investment planning, insurance planning. That's holistic planning. So estate planning, I break it down into two things. It's basically who's going to get my stuff, right? And who can help me out when I need it. So your stuff, as defined by an estate, is everything you own. So it's your investment accounts, it's your car, it's your house, it's your clothes, it's your jewelry, right? And there's a lot of different ways to get that stuff to somebody else. One of the big questions we get with the estate and doing the planning is, will I owe any taxes? So a few years ago, they passed some laws that raised the estate tax exemption amount. So everybody in this room has $5.45 million that they can give to somebody else before they'll pay some estate tax when you die. If you're married, you get to multiply that amount times 2. So $10.9 million you can give to anybody in the world, and there won't be any estate tax owed on those dollars. So for most of us, we're under that 10.9 threshold. So we're not going to owe tax when we pass our assets to somebody else. The one thing that you hear and people are fearful of is, what is probate, right? Anybody here gone through probate before? Okay. And we're still around, right? So it's not this big, mean, nasty thing. What it typically does, though, it lengthens the process of settling an estate. So there are ways that you can avoid probate and make sure assets or your stuff get to those that you want a little bit more quickly. The definition of probate, though, is all establishing the legitimacy of a will. So you go to the court, you show them the will, the judge says this is a legitimate will, and then the executor, whoever you've assigned to distribute your stuff, gets to do what they want. Now in that handout, there's a good front and back page, like a 2-page thing. It says the key estate documents that you need. The one in there is the revocable trust. Some of you in the room may have revocable trusts. Not everyone necessarily needs them, but at a minimum, you need the will, You need to have medical directives. That means a financial or a healthcare power of attorney, a living will. And you also need a financial power of attorney. Now, does anybody in the room have a financial power of attorney? Okay. Do you know if it's durable or non-durable?
I think it's durable.
Okay. What's durable mean, Gladys?
Means you can change it when you want.
You can change it, but basically it means it lasts through incapacity. All right? So the whole concept of making sure that somebody can help you out when you need it, you probably want that person to be able to do it when you're incapacitated. Now, non-durable just means that it's in effect while you're able to make your own decisions. Let's say you're out of the country and you need somebody to help you at home, but you're still able to make decisions for yourself. So the other question is, what does a will simply do? I said before, a will is going to tell you who's going to get my stuff. The other thing a will does is it names who is going to take care of my children. And when I read my parents' will, I was pretty happy because they picked out my favorite aunt, and I still tease her to this day. When my parents pass, we get to go move in with them. And she said no. But we're hoping. One of the things the will does, it does make sure that all your stuff is split up. Now, the one thing we'll say is you don't want to be too specific in the information you put in there. You want to give broad guidelines. So you don't want to say, who gets my favorite Indians t-shirt? Because everybody's an Indians fan now that they went to the World Series. But it does need to be specific and who you want to get get your stuff. Now, on top of a will, many of you have designated beneficiaries on your accounts. And most of them look like, if you're married, my spouse will receive everything in this account, and then after that, it's going to be my kids. Has anybody here added a per stirpes to their account? Or know what per stirpes is?
No.
Okay, good. See, it's a great question, right? Per stirpes simply means if you leave money to someone and that person predeceases you, the money that would have gone to them would go along their bloodline. So think of an event, a married couple, one of the spouses passes away. Now, the primary beneficiaries of the accounts are the kids. And the surviving spouse would like those assets to remain amongst their children's children, so the grandkids, versus being divvied up amongst the remaining children, okay, if one passes away. That's per stirpes. And that's a great conversation to have, okay? So, for example, if you had 4 beneficiaries on an account and one passed away, the remaining assets would be split up amongst the 3 unless you added per stirpes. If you add per stirpes and one of the 4 passes away, their assets would go to their bloodline. It doesn't go to the spouse, their spouse. It goes to their bloodline. And there's a number of issues that I'd suggest you talk to your advisor and your estate planner when adding per stirpes. The other thing you can add beneficiaries to in the state of Ohio, we'll see if we can do a pop quiz here. Jim, what can you add a TOD to in the state of Ohio?
Checking account?
Checking account?
Oh, I gotta go on?
House, right? House, car, motorcycle, boat, right?
Anything of value.
Kind of anything of value, yeah. Financial related assets, or your bank accounts uses the term POD, right? A payable on death. Same concept though. Essentially what that document does though, is it directs what that thing should go to, who's that thing should go to. So for example, my mother passed 5 years ago. If you ever met the lady, you wouldn't believe what I'm about to say, but she was about 5'2". She was a college professor, and she took up riding Harley Davidsons the last couple of years of her life. Right? Rode all over the country. Amazing, leather and all, beautiful. She knew she was sick, and when she passed, she had added a TOD on her Harley. So when I was settling her estate, I walked into the BMV. You could see there that my name was, the beneficiary of that Harley, and it was switched over very quickly. If that TOD wasn't on the Harley, well, we would have had to go through the courts. The executor would have to go to the BMV, and there'd be all this back and forth, just prolonging the process. So it costs a little bit of money to get the changeover, but it happens much more quickly, and that's something all of you can do now. So that's the pre-planning part of it. Now, we've been talking about who gets my stuff, but I think the thing that Randy Kale, Mark, myself, and the other advisors in the office are concerned about is if there's incapacity, there's an event, you can't make decisions for yourself, who's going to help you, right? And that's what a financial power of attorney does for all of your money and stuff like that. But there's also the healthcare power of attorney. You know, who can help you make medical decisions? Now, my family, if you can believe it, there's 7 children. There are 2 boys and there are 5 girls. So you can guess who wins the arguments. We just basically gave up at this point. But my father, now being a widower, I sat him down and I said, if something happens to you, who do you want to help you out? And he said, well, you kind of make sense for the financial stuff because this is what I do all day. But my brother just so happens to be a pharmacist and he's the medical power of attorney. So 2 weekends ago, we went down to Blazing Bill's. Anybody been to Blazing Bill's? Yeah, pretty good ribs. First time, can't believe it. And we had this conversation of what do you want to have happen to you if you can't make decisions for yourself? If you have dementia, do you want to go into a nursing home, not go into a nursing home? And he said, I never want to go into one of those places, just like Cale said, his father said. And my brother, thankfully, just said, well, it's probably not going to be up to you, right? And then we'll just do a lottery of who gets to keep them, maybe, if we really stick to it. But the financial power of attorney, when he travels, I can help him with stuff, right? If there's a charge on his credit card, I call the credit card company, I say, you know what, there's a suspicious charge, you know, please tell me what it's about and then we can challenge it or whatnot. Or we did his banking the other day. Now, I did just learn this. He had Wells Fargo accounts. Oh, okay. It's because he moved from Colorado back to Ohio. There's no Wells Fargo branches, but we moved him to Chase recently. And we walked into the bank and I told the lady, I said, we would like to add the kids as beneficiaries to his accounts. And she said, how many? And I said 7. She goes, wow, that's a lot. She goes, well, we can add as many as you want. I said, great. Most financial institutions, he said, do not do that. Now, we come to find out, Chase, for example, will only add 5, okay? And there are other institutions that will only maybe add 1 or 2, and I think it's for administrative purposes. But if you haven't done it yet, walk into your bank, talk to the teller or the financial representative, and ask them to add a POD to your accounts. Money can be transferred much quicker. Now, a lot of us here, hopefully someday when I retire, you retire and then you go to Florida or some other warm climate. And after a while, you see that it snows in the winter here every year. And you decide to just stay down there for longer and longer periods of time. And many of you might buy a property there. A lot of our clients do. The biggest issue when purchasing or owning property in 2 different states is something called ancillary probate. Has anybody ever heard of it? Okay. So again, probate, it's just a prolonged process. So owning properties in 2 states, ancillary probate simply means that you'll have to go through probate in 2 different states, prolonging the process. So one of the things we'll suggest once we find that people own property in multiple states is own it in joint name, right? Put 2 people's names on there. Odds are 2 people passing away at the same time are not very likely. And then after one of the 2 people pass, you can just update the beneficiaries, add another name. You could put it into a revocable trust, and in that handout, again, there's some information on revocable trust. There is extra expense when dealing with that, but the nice thing about the revocable trust is instead of having to change the beneficiaries on all your different assets, if your asset is in the trust, you just update the trust document, right? You go back to the attorney that drew it up for you, and you change the beneficiaries. Now, in the state of Ohio, like I said, you can put a transfer on death deed, all right, a TOD to the deed. And there are some pitfalls to that. So imagine, again, my family. My father passes away. If we had a TOD on his stuff or his house, we would now have 7 owners of a home. And I said before, decisions are not made very quickly in my family. There's a lot of conversation. So to avoid that whole issue, it goes through the will, and then the will just says, sell the thing and split up the money 7 ways. Simple. Takes a little bit longer, not a big deal though. So that's my part of the presentation. Any questions I can answer for you right now?
Okay, we had a couple more, but as I say, if you have questions, we're happy to address them. Well, one of the questions that came up recently was, I've heard there's tax-free investments. What are those? And so there's really two types of things that are tax exempt or tax-free. Now, some things are tax deferred, meaning you don't pay the tax till later, like an IRA or an annuity, but you do pay tax when you take it out. Tax-free or tax exempt means you never pay tax. And typically, that would be a municipal bond, some sort issued by state or local governments, and the interest is not taxed at the federal level, and in some cases it may not be taxed at the state level, depending on the bond. Individual bonds are becoming harder to find. The minimum investment's typically $10,000, but there are tax-exempt bond funds, which would be a mutual fund that buys tax-exempt bonds, and these can be state or local tax-exempt. Now, the benefits from the asset-based long-term care that Gail spoke about, the death benefit, that's considered life insurance, that is tax-free to the beneficiaries. But those are really the only things. And then the last thing be Roth IRAs. If someone has a Roth IRA, typically it's after-tax money you put in, but then everything it earns, when you take it out, there's no tax. The other thing about that is, if you think about it, my dad, for example, did not want myself and my sisters to pay tax on his IRA. And he had stopped working. He wasn't in a huge tax bracket. So he actually converted his IRA to a Roth. He paid the tax, but then from that day on, it grew tax-free. The other nice thing about Roth IRAs, there's no required minimum distribution. Remember we talked about the required distributions at 70.5. So really the things that are tax-free or tax-exempt be Roth IRAs, life insurance proceeds, and municipal bonds. And then the municipal bonds, you can buy a fund or you could try to buy the bonds themselves, but typically the funds are a much better way to go at this point. And they're not going to pay a huge rate of return. You know, typically today on a bond fund that's federally tax exempt, but you might pay Ohio tax around 4%. If it's federal and state, it's probably a little less. So it's not a huge amount. But again, it's not, as Gail said, I do like to say, it's not what you make, it's what you keep. And so if you make 4% tax-free, for some people that's better than 6% taxable. And so we need to look at that. And that again comes back to one of the initial things we spoke about. By seeing the various assets, it's much easier to do tax planning as well as everything else. What else? Any questions yet? Yep, Bob.
Gail, you were talking about long-term care insurance, and I'm sitting here thinking, how do you decide between using that or if you have enough assets to basically do the same thing?
Sure. Yeah, and that is a lot of times the consideration is, do I self-insure, which is saying I've got enough assets to cover this, or do I leverage the insurance company and buy one of these policies? You know, the fact of the matter is, if we had a crystal ball and we knew you were going to use we knew you were going to use the long-term care insurance, clearly you'd be better off buying the insurance. But we also have to remember that the insurance companies are the ones that are issuing these policies. They never lose. So, you know, the costs that are associated with that, you know, by the law of large numbers, you know, they're going to be better off. But it's definitely something to consider, and we can run different scenarios and models saying, well, you know, what if we had the absolute worst case scenario, maybe a 15-year event at X dollars a year? How does my portfolio hold up to that? And that's where the conversation, I think, would go.
You know, one thing I would add to that real quickly, that question is one of the reasons the asset-based insurance is so interesting. Because if you pay for it with a lump sum payment, in other words, you put in a chunk of money, one of three things is going to happen. One, you need long-term care, in which case you kind of win from the fact you have the insurance. Two, you never use it, you never touch it, you pass away. Your heirs are going to get a multiple of what you put in. And at age 65 for a couple, it's a little better than 2 to 1, tax-free. So it's not a bad investment. But the third thing is, if you ever want to get your money out, you can walk away anytime and get all your money back. So 100%. Now you may not get interest. The interest rate guaranteed is 4%, but you do forego some of the interest if you walk away. But if you think about that, basically, you're putting the money in, it's going to earn 4% tax sheltered. If you need long-term care, you have long-term care. If you need the money, you can get it back out. And if you never touch it, never do anything, someone's going to get it. And so the decision's a little bit different than with traditional insurance, which you're right, it raises all the problems Cale spoke about. Okay, we got some more questions. Okay,
So with the asset-based insurance, is there a limit to the payout? I mean, once the assets have been used up in long-term care, it stops?
Sure. So the way that it works is, of course, it's dependent on your age when you apply. The other thing about these asset-based policies is they do cover joint life, so you can have a joint life policy. So the way it would work is typically you'll fund it with an upfront lump sum. The day you fund it, you'll know what they call it your benefit base. So hypothetically, let's say you put $100,000 into this, perhaps that generates a $200,000, they call it benefit base. That means that if something were to happen, where you needed long-term care, they allow you to draw on that $200,000 benefit base. It's actually to let you take 2% of the account, the benefit base amount per month is a long-term care benefit, but that's also what is driving the death benefit. So the actual numbers, it depends on how much you put into the policy, depends on how old you are, it depends on your health.
But it
he's
does
talking
have,
about the rider.
it does have a maximum payout.
Well, it has so the maximum payout, let's call that the base policy. So in that scenario, the maximum payout on that would be $200,000. But I had mentioned they have the lifetime benefits options. That is an additional, they call it a rider. So that's something you would pay an additional amount each year on that, and that would extend to, in this instance, 2% on the $200,000 base is $4,000 a month. Well, if you elected that lifetime benefit rider, once you get past that, you've collected the $200,000, they would continue to send you $4,000 per month that you couldn't outlive. So there isn't a cap in that sense if you elect the rider.
And that's a good question. My dad, for example, he had long-term care insurance. He had Parkinson's. And then both to Cale's point and the other, in the beginning it wasn't so bad. We had someone come in a couple hours a day. Over the years it got worse. Eventually he had someone living with him 24/7. Well, by the time he passed away, it was about $15,000 a month. Over his period of care, he collected just over $900,000 from the long-term care company. I mean, they hated him. I'm sure they were, please go. But he collected almost $900,000. And the thing with that was, it allowed him to stay at home. So it kept him out of the nurse home. But to your point, which is correct, because he had the lifetime benefit, it just kept paying. All right, I'm gonna let Bobby go out there so everyone can hear the question.
Oh, now see what he asks. My question is, if you have a traditional policy, can you transfer to an asset-based?
It depends. Most likely you can't transfer the existing policy, but it certainly wouldn't be a bad idea to consider what options you have. So that would be a scenario where we know obviously you have the traditional policy, and if you got it several years ago, it's certainly a better deal than if you were to apply for a new traditional policy now. So the numbers in terms of how that decision would play out may favor that traditional policy that you already have, but that would be something that we'd want to look at those specific numbers and see if continuing the traditional policy is the right move. And in a lot of cases it is.
Thank you.
Cale, I think you may have answered this, but I just want to make sure. An asset-based policy, you said, you referred to, you used the word joint. So a couple could buy an asset-based policy as opposed to now you both have to have your own policy.
Right, and so the asset-based policy that we use, they actually have a patent on joint life insurance with the long-term care portion, and that's exactly right. So for a couple, they would have a joint policy, one policy that covers long-term care on both. And typically, because in terms of the death benefit, the insurance doesn't pay out until that second death. So in a lot of situations there, a joint policy actually will provide a higher benefit base because the likelihood of that second death is less than on that single life. But absolutely, you'd have a joint policy. And then in the event that you had a simultaneous long-term care scenario, you both needed care at the same time, the benefit is based on each individual person. So in the scenario we talked about before with a $4,000 a month benefit, if each of you needed care at the same time, the policy would be paying out a total of $8,000 a month, $4,000 to each person individually.
Other questions? Yep.
Does it work? I just want to say about TOD, if you're married and you're both on the title, you can't get a TOD in Ohio on your vehicle.
Mhm.
And on your house, you can just pick one of your children
Mhm.
to be on the TOD. You don't have them all on the TOD.
Mhm.
Just pick the honest one.
Yeah, I think obviously assigning beneficiaries is something you coordinate with your estate planning attorney because that is legal advice. But the other thing to consider when you're assigning one beneficiary to any large asset, assuming your home is a large asset, that person is going to solely inherit that asset. If then they're instructed to sell the home, let's say there's $500,000 in proceeds, them getting the money tax efficiently to the other people that were supposed to get it is also a question because there's these gift tax transfer limits, right? So all of us can only give up to $14,000 a year to anybody we want without having to report it to the IRS. So there wouldn't be a gift tax issue necessarily, but
$14,000 per person.
per person. Yeah, so
$28,000 if you're married then a year.
correct. Yeah, so correct. So there's these, we're getting into the more or less transferring assets after after somebody passes, but you wouldn't have to pay tax on the money that was transferred because the gift tax exemption limit is also $5.45 million. So you have a lot of money you can give to people. Once you just give over $14,000 or $28,000 as a married couple, you just have to report it to the IRS. Okay, so it's really not a big deal.
It'd be $28,000.
Excuse me?
On a couple, it would be $28,000.
Yes. The question is if it's a couple, married couple, yes, it's $28,000, $14,000 times 2.
Or for any of the kids.
Correct.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. I'll let you guys go. Bob, you had a question?
Yeah, my question is, nobody can predict what Congress is going to do or accomplish.
But what sort of things are in play that may affect decisions we've already made that could change? Whether that be, distribution of assets or the $5,000 or the $5 million, exemption and those sorts of things. What kind of things have been bantered about that could change that we can't control?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can control any of it, to tell you the truth. The biggest thing is changing taxes in general is very difficult. I mean, it's always pitched that you can tax the wealthy, and that seems to play politically well. The biggest thing that we've seen talked about are so-called loophole closers, things that people aren't really going to notice. So, for example, right now, if someone passes away and they leave their IRA to their children, the children can spread it over their lifetime. They're saying get rid of that. The kids will have to pay taxes right away within 5 years. The estate tax thing, frankly, the government makes very little money on estate taxes, and they never have, because very few people ever fell within the limits. there's some talk on limiting the amount of assets that get stepped up. Right now, if you have assets when you pass away and you go to your kids, the basis, what you paid for them, gets stepped up. They're talking about limiting that to $1 million. So if you had a big estate, you might not pay estate tax, but now the kids might have to pay income tax or capital gains. So there are a lot of things like that, but I mean, certainly you can't predict. The one thing I would say is if you're doing estate planning with your attorney, anything you do that's irrevocable obviously is going to pin you into something that's irrevocable. So to the extent that it makes sense, I would avoid anything that's irrevocable in the planning. But beyond that, who's to know? I mean, we'll know more in about 12 hours which direction we're going in. Although frankly, and again, you'll see this in the book, which party wins really doesn't have that much impact on the markets. Historically, it's been about 50-50, and I'm not going to spend much time, but the book really does get into some of the policy decisions and how it's gone if you have a Republican president with a Democratic House or Democratic Senate, if all parties, etc. So you can look at the scenarios. I mean, it looks like the House is going to stay Republican, and the Senate will probably go whichever way the White House goes today. So, we'll have to see. Okay, one more question.
And do you have anything to say about annuities?
Do I have anything to say about annuities? Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. First of all, it's like anything else. There's good annuities and bad annuities. The ones that you hear about on TV are just terrible. I mean, you need to avoid these so-called equity indexed annuities. And the pitch is this. When the market goes up, you'll participate in the market. When the market goes down, you make a fair rate of return. But in the coming Armageddon, you'll never lose money. Well, all of that's sort of true. I mean, first of all, those annuities tie you up for at least 10 years. So if you take out more than 10%, and the 10% you take out is taxable. Second of all, those annuities typically make very little. There's setups, they don't really participate when the market goes up, and you might make 1 or 2% if you're lucky. The people selling them make a lot of money. These are equity indexed annuities. And frankly, if you Google equity indexed annuity lawsuits, you'll see a lot of states have actually tried to file suits against these. As far as other types of annuities, it really depends. I mean, the big thing is we don't like annuities that tie people up. We have clients with annuities, and some of them have some good benefits, some of them don't. The one thing I'll say is annuities, like any other insurance product, tend to be fairly expensive. There are a lot of expenses built in. So whether the benefits outweigh the expense or not, something we'd have to look at. The annuities that we've worked with, typically there's no cost up front. There's no cost to get out at any time. So at least you're not tied up. But the internal expense is relatively high. So they're not going to make as much money as just investing. What you get for that expense is typically one of two things. Either a guaranteed death benefit of some sort. So no matter what the market does, if you pass away, someone's going to get a guaranteed amount. Or they may have a withdrawal benefit that says no matter what the market does, you get at least a guaranteed income of some sort. But, there's been a big push to regulate these equity indexed annuities. And the fact is you don't have to have a securities license to sell them. You don't get a prospectus. They're not considered a security. There was a big push to do that, and obviously the insurance lobby is pretty strong, and they pushed back. So at this point, you can take a 1-week course, get your insurance license, and sell these things. I mean, literally, that's what it takes in Ohio. So I'd be very leery of anything that sounds kind of too good to be true.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, couple things. One, if you do have questions, speak to your advisor. We appreciate your coming out, but certainly the next month's going to be interesting as far as that goes. Two, there is a lot of new stuff coming out, and actually follow up to Bob's question. We're going to have a better idea of what legislation goes into effect for 2017 after the budget's passed in December. Congress always waits till the last minute, and that's like the qualified charitable distribution thing passed at the end of last year. Saturday, January 14th, we're doing our annual resource breakfast. A little bit different this year. We got some folks from Raymond James coming up to talk about some new technology that's available. They have a mobile app for the phones. They've got a bunch of stuff they're going to talk about. And at that point, we'll talk about legislation we know has passed or is pending for the coming year. Plus, we'll have a better idea about this DOL rule, which is just going to be very tumultuous for the markets. But that should be clarified somewhat by January. So with that, we appreciate your coming out and hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.